Hi everyone, welcome. These two worm bins with the African nightcrawlers in them are now, I believe, all set for haul out. It's been 8 days since we last checked in here together, at which point they've been going through this horizontal migration process for, I don't know, this point where are we? We're 26 days in, so almost 4 weeks since we nudged all the finished compost off to one edge of the bin and set up these plastic covered sections of the bin that I refer to as their horizontal migration feeding zones, to try to get the worms to migrate on their own out of their finished castings, all the while leaving the stuff uncovered so that it can evaporate and dry. On a few occasions I've been in here to till the material around and stir it up, try to get the dry stuff on the surface down and to bring up the stuff that's down low that's still somewhat damp and needs to dry, and that process in itself also kind of works as a little bit of a repellent to get the worms motivated to go find something more comfortable. So today I'm prepared to move them out and get them into their new bins. I've got a couple new systems ready and waiting. No labels yet because no worms live in them yet, but that's soon to change. So I'm going to get a glove on, get the systems up on the bench, and we're going to get to hauling them out and launching a couple new bins. So let's get to work. Well, before we get my hands all soiled, let's share some stats. The systems are 320 days in service now, and I believe we might have already mentioned how the migration has been in progress for 26 days, and during that time we fed the horizontal migration feeding zones 3 times. So even though the systems were fed altogether 27 times in total, in a way I consider the finished castings as the product of 24 feedings, and then the 3 feedings that were used to get the worms to move into their horizontal migration feeding zones, in my mind, get extracted, so they don't really count as far as the finished product of these containers. So that's just one of these little weird fine points of how I like to think of the feedings relative to the amount of castings that were produced in here. So let's see what else. The new bins. The new bins have been actually sitting here for 5 weeks, waiting for the occupants to get moved in. And it was only earlier today that I finally went in there to add some food. I put some very moldy bread that I thoroughly dampened, as well as some coffee and grit, into the middle of the bin as sort of a welcoming meal for them to enjoy once they arrive in their new home. So let's work on getting them over there. Now the horizontal migration feeding zones were covered with plastic to make sure they were protected from drying and evaporation. So I trying to figure out where that worm is. Did some sort of a, how the heck would a worm make its way in to this plastic container? That is so unusual. That is, of course, unless there's a hole down here somewhere. But I don't think there is. So that is a mystery to me, but it seems like any other worms we spot on the plastic are most likely to be on the outside. But yeah, that was kind of strange. I do my best to prevent the worms from getting down into the bags that I use by trying to position the opening in a place where the worms can't easily get to it. But, you know, I don't go crazy on setting that sort of stuff up. It's just sort of a best effort to prevent some sort of a weird situation happening where the poor wormies get stranded and end up unaliving themselves that way. So I'm going to see if I could nudge some of this finished castings away from the horizontal migration feeding zone, just to make the work on hauling out the contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone a little bit easier. I do like to keep this stuff separate so that when I finally have my batch of finished vermicompost over here, it doesn't end up littered with all kinds of materials from the horizontal migration feeding zone. That's kind of the idea behind putting up this little dividing partition cardboard. But you know, after almost 4 weeks of that cardboard sitting there in between the vermicompost and the migration feeding zone, it's not too surprising that it gets pretty worn away by worms nibbling on it as they pass by it on their way to the horizontal migration feeding zone. And I suppose it doesn't matter so much if I bring a little bit of vermicompost along for the ride when we do the haul out, so that the worms have a little bit of familiar material to remain in until such a time that they feel comfortable enough to venture into the new environment that we built for them. So let's get to hauling them out. I got these 2 pretty good sized containers, which I hope are going to be adequate in size to hold the contents of each system's horizontal migration feeding zone. So here we go. I'm going to remind everyone that at the end of the video, I'm going to be looking to you guys to provide input into how many worms you believe were hauled out here and then ultimately released into those new bins that we're going to move them into. And then what I find fun is taking everyone's estimates from the comments and averaging them together, and that includes an estimate that I provide as well. Look at all those nice castings piling up. And that's how I end up with the estimates for how many worms occupy my systems. Many of you know that already, but if you're new to my channel, I invite you to participate in the fun. Everyone's welcome to leave a comment and let me know what you think in terms of how many worms were launched into each new system of mine. Lots and lots of castings piling up. And you know, we did bump into the main event food item that had been placed in here for the worms when I set these horizontal migration feeding zones up. And it seems so unusual that I'm having trouble finding it now. It's the half of a seed from a mango. So I really just took an entire mango and hacked it in half, throwing 1/2 of each, or half of the mango, into each system, serving as the main food source for the horizontal migration. And then later on we came in 2 other times to reinforce the feeding zone. Well, I don't know, there's a pretty good amount of worms right there in that last handful. There must have been some really yummy food over there that they were still working on. That last check-in 8 days ago, I think the foods that we placed in here for them might have been lettuce, perhaps some other stuff too, very likely coffee as well. But now we're starting to get a glimpse into how many worms are going to get released into the new bin number 1 that they're going to be moved into. I figured as long as we've already got an existing bin number 1 and bin number 2 over here, we'll just keep it the same. The worms that came out of old bin number 1 will go into the new bin number 1. Likewise, the old bin number 2 occupants will be positioned into the new bin number 2. And I'll usually just take this remnant of the horizontal migration feeding zone and take it with them to their new home. And now we can take a little peek over here on the edge to see if there's a whole lot of worm activity still remaining. Perhaps pick out any little lingering bits of bedding type material that might have gotten mixed in, but I think we did a pretty good job keeping these worm castings for the most part free of debris and nice and clean, so that it can lend itself to being a really nice, neat and clean harvest. So that's going to be the haul out of the worms occupying bin number 1. Let's do the same over here in bin number 2. Once again, I invite you to look at what I'm doing here, keeping in mind that at some point I'd really like for you to submit a comment to let me know how many worms you believe were released into bin number 2, the new bin number 2. And there are a lot of worms hanging out here. Here's the half of a seed of a mango that was used to horizontally feed bin number 2, which will accompany the worms into their new home. Kind of makes me wonder, why was it that there were so many worms in that last handful when we did the haul out in bin number 1? I wonder if it just has something to do with the orientation of the container and which side is facing what part of the room or something like that. Kind of made me wonder if the last handful of material we pull out of here in bin number 2 would also be the most heavily populated. It was pretty heavily populated, but I don't know if it was quite as exciting as what we saw in that last handful that came out of bin number 1. But both bins definitely have a high number of worms. Good sized population. Really nice to see the turnout that we got here in the horizontal migration feeding zone. I'll tell you, I already felt like, even perhaps at the second check-in, let alone the third check-in we did together 8 days ago, it already seemed to me like even at the previous check-in we had already gotten to the point where it seemed like the majority of the worms had already exited their finished castings and had made their way over into the new horizontal migration feeding zone. And I guess, you know, if the material that they were occupying is free of any food substance and has been depleted of most of the bedding material, it's not too surprising that if they stumble on a section of the bin, being the horizontal migration feeding zone, and find all kinds of fresh food, fresh bedding, everything else, that they're going to stay. They're going to go over there and stay there. So we're going to set these systems aside, and I'm not going to leave all the worms that are still in these systems behind. I'll probably set up bait boxes to try to lure the remaining straggler worms out of the material in here, but I'm going to do that off camera at another time. I'm not so worried about that. I'll probably actually spread all this material out so that it can even continue to dry a little bit more. Maybe I'll just deploy the bait boxes in a few days after the material has had a little bit more of a chance to kick off some more of its moisture, further motivating the worms to seek out something better to be in. So let's take a quick pause. I'll rearrange the things out here on the bench, and we'll proceed to launching off the new systems. So let's get to that. So now the systems have been returned to the shelf here, and I've backfilled the void that was here where the horizontal migration feeding zone was to try to spread this material out as much as I can, and in the process I tried to crumble and aerate as best I can, and there's a lot of worms remaining in this stuff, I gotta say, but it did seem to me like performing the haul out would be a good precursor step to trying to get this stuff fully depopulated, and then just trying later to, you know, bait the worms out. And I'm not going to deploy the bait boxes. I got these perforated boxes that I'll fill up with nice bedding and food and place them right here on the surface of each system to try to attract the stragglers and be able to do a final haul out. But I do believe that allowing this stuff to dry a little bit more before I put these on, it would probably benefit the process, because placing these out here is just going to stifle any evaporation that might be able to happen if they weren't there, and the stuff would just remain really damp. The worms would never be motivated to try to leave this stuff, so I believe that drying is going to be the first critical step to a successful final baiting of the material to get the stragglers out. But I just figured I'd show you really quick before we move on to releasing the worms in their new home, so let's get on to doing that now. Alright, here we are. Here's the hauled out contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone of old bin number 1 going into new bin number 1 over here, and likewise the contents of old bin number 2's horizontal migration feeding zone going into the new bin number 2. So let's Let's make this into a swift and elegant process. Famous last words. This is probably the point where everything gets spilled on the floor and makes a huge mess, but let's see if we can avoid anything like that from happening. Let's proceed to releasing the worms into their new home. So, as I always do, I ask that you look carefully at how many worms were released and leave a comment. Let me know. How many worms do you believe were released into each system? Most people seem to believe that the numbers are not always exactly the same, so most people will say X number of worms released into the first system and the X number of worms released into the second system, and then, like I said earlier, I'll take those values and average them together, resulting in what we end up treating as the official worm count for each of my new bins. So let's let them settle in, and after you've had a chance to come up with a guesstimate, please remember to leave a comment. Alright, let's see, we had half of a mango seed in each system, and I could see the one in bin number 2. The one in bin number 1 is eluding me. It's kind of nice to be digging through this material a little bit and finding that the worms have already retreated so far down into the material that they're actually down in the new stuff that I built for them. So in a way it makes me feel like I've created a nice hospitable space for them, and I'm finding some old leftover stems from some of the food that was fed to them late in the game and never got fully broken down and ended up in the horizontal migration feeding zones. And you know, took a while, but I finally zeroed in on the half of a mango seed. It just seemed to me like I would position it right here in the middle along with these couple of stems that came along for the ride as well, right over the center, which is where I had placed the very moldy rolls and coffee and other stuff, before dropping on a coffee filter to indicate where I had fed the systems before releasing the worms. So similarly, we'll take the half a mango seed, and I think there might have even been some similar stems in here as well. Maybe not. What is this? Do I have corncob spheres in here? Did I completely lose track of corncob spheres? Or am I just bumping into a object that resembles corncob spheres? I guess I might have gotten so distracted over recent weeks with the migration and everything that I completely forgot that we had these little round chunks of corncob in these systems. I could be wrong. I could just be getting them confused, but it sure looked that way to me. So let's cover up these bins. I've got some nice new newspaper covers, so that even though I'm using translucent plastic, which will let a little bit of light through, we've actually got opaque material here in the form of the newspaper to provide them with some nice darkness so that they can feel comfortable coming up to the surface and roaming around up top. And that's pretty much it. Well, not entirely, because there's always that one last little formality, and a lot of you know what that is. So let's get to doing that and we'll be done. Yep, that's right. For those of you that know, you know. But for those of you that might be new to the channel and are not aware, we always like to christen our new worm bins. And that doesn't officially happen until the worms are occupying the space and have had their official labels affixed. So I invite you all to join me in welcoming the two newest systems in my wormery, African Nightcrawler bin number 1, African Nightcrawler bin number 2, and If you're wondering what these little tiny letters are, CWL, that's the crazy worm lady. These are the African nightcrawlers I received way back when in the form of cocoons from Emily, the crazy worm lady. She's been offline for many years now, but we still have little things here and there to remind us of the old worm channels that we learned from back in the day. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.